The letter had arrived 3 days ago, and Eleanor Whitmore had read it 17 times since, each reading colder than the last. Your presence is required at Ashford Hall to answer for the conduct of Miss Margaret Whitmore. Margaret. Her sister. Her reckless, romantic, ruinous sister, who had somehow entangled herself in a scandal involving the Duke of Ashford's name, his betrothal, and a broken engagement now whispered about in every drawing-room from London to York. Eleanor did not fully understand what Margaret had done. Only that it was bad enough to summon a Whitmore to Ashford Hall like a criminal called before a magistrate. Their father could not go, his health would not permit the journey. Margaret would not go, she had taken to her bed in tears, refusing to face the man she'd wronged. So it fell to Eleanor, the practical sister, the sensible sister, to climb into a hired carriage and ride north into Yorkshire to offer an apology that was not even hers to give. She had rehearsed her words the entire journey. Your Grace, my family deeply regrets the distress caused. My sister acted without thought for the consequences. She had not rehearsed what would happen when the Duke of Ashford rose from behind his desk, studied her with eyes like winter stone, and said, quite simply, "You will do." "I beg your pardon." "You heard me, Miss Whitmore. Your sister has made me a laughingstock. I require a wife, and I require one now, before the gossip finishes what it started. You came here to make amends." His jaw tightened. "You may make them by marrying me." Eleanor's carefully rehearsed apology died on her tongue. She had come to say she was sorry. She had not come to become a duchess. "That is absurd," Eleanor said, when she finally found her voice. "You cannot simply, Your Grace, we have never met. You know nothing of me." "I know your family owes mine a debt of honor," the Duke replied, his voice as even as a ledger being balanced. "I know that within a fortnight, half of England will believe I was jilted and made a fool of by a Whitmore woman who could not be trusted to keep her word. And I know that a swift, respectable marriage to a different Whitmore woman would silence every tongue in London before the story finishes spreading. You would use me to repair your pride." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite offense, not quite agreement. "I would use you to repair what your family broke, Miss Whitmore. Call it what you like." Eleanor should have refused. Every instinct told her to gather her skirts, march back to the carriage, and let the Duke of Ashford solve his own scandal. But she thought of her father, grey-faced and apologizing between coughs. She thought of Margaret, sobbing that she hadn't meant for any of it to happen, that she didn't even understand how it had happened. She thought of the family's dwindling fortunes, and the merchant creditors who had begun calling more frequently than was polite. A marriage to a duke would silence more than gossip. "And if I agree," she said carefully, "what would you expect of me?" "Civility. Discretion. The appearance of a contented marriage." He paused. "I do not require affection, Miss Whitmore. I require order restored." Order restored. As though she were a column of figures he intended to correct. She should have hated him for it. Instead, she found herself studying him, the tightness in his shoulders, the exhaustion beneath his composure, a man clearly as trapped by circumstance as she was. Whatever Margaret had done, it had cost him something he was not saying aloud. "I need to understand what happened," Eleanor said. "My sister would never deliberately embarrass a stranger. She isn't cruel. Reckless, perhaps. Not cruel." For a moment, the Duke's expression shifted, not quite doubt, but something close to it. "Your sister sent letters that were never hers to send, Miss Whitmore, to a woman who was never meant to see them. My former betrothed ended our engagement believing I had betrayed her before the ink on our contract had dried. That doesn't sound like Margaret at all. It happened regardless." He turned toward the window, toward the grey Yorkshire hills beyond the glass. "Whether you understand it or not, Miss Whitmore, the damage is done. The only question now is whether you intend to help me undo it." Eleanor looked at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and thought of the 17 readings of that letter, and the apology she had never gotten to give. "Very well," she said quietly. I'll marry you. She did not yet know she had just stepped into the middle of a lie far larger than either of them understood. The wedding was small, hurried, and utterly without warmth, precisely as the Duke had wanted. Eleanor stood beside him in the Ashford Hall chapel wearing a gown borrowed from a cousin, reciting vows to a man she had known for 11 days, and told herself this was simply the practical solution to an impractical problem. Nothing more. She did not expect Clara Hastings to appear at her side within the week. I came the moment I heard, Clara said, embracing her tightly in the drafty corridor outside Eleanor's new chambers. Married. To a duke. Eleanor, what happened? Eleanor told her, the letter, the summons, the astonishing proposal, and Clara's brow furrowed deeper with every word. None of this sounds like Margaret, Clara said finally. I know your sister is impulsive, but sending private letters to humiliate a stranger's betrothal? That's not carelessness, Eleanor. That's calculated. That's what I thought too. But the Duke seemed certain. Certain, or told to be certain. Clara's eyes narrowed. Who discovered the letters in the first place? Who brought them to the former lady's attention? Eleanor hadn't thought to ask. She resolved to. The opportunity came sooner than expected, in the form of Lord Pembroke, the Duke's cousin, a smiling, silver-tongued man who had taken to visiting Ashford Hall with unusual frequency since the wedding. Your Grace, he said to Eleanor over dinner one evening, raising his glass with theatrical warmth, how fortunate for Ashford that scandal delivered him such a lovely bride. Almost as though it were designed for his benefit. The Duke's jaw tightened. Careful, Pembroke. I only mean it kindly, cousin. Pembroke's smile did not waver. But Eleanor noticed something the Duke, distracted by irritation, did not, the flicker of satisfaction in Pembroke's eyes as he watched them both, like a man observing a plan unfolding exactly as intended. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered to the estate study to find a book, only to discover the door ajar and Pembroke's voice drifting from within, low and clipped, speaking to someone she couldn't see. The letters served their purpose. Ashford's tied to a merchant's daughter now, his reputation in shreds, exactly as we needed. Once his creditors see the marriage as a mark of desperation, the estate will be mine too. Eleanor's breath caught. She stepped back too quickly, her sleeve catching a vase on the hall table. It shattered against the floor. Pembroke's voice stopped instantly. She fled before the door opened, heart hammering, the fragments of his words assembling themselves into something monstrous in her mind. The letters served their purpose. Not Margaret's letters. Not Margaret's doing. Someone had orchestrated this from the very beginning, and it hadn't been her sister at all. Eleanor said nothing to the Duke that night. She lay awake instead, turning Pembroke's words over and over, searching for an innocent explanation and finding none. The next morning, she sought out Clara. I heard him, Eleanor whispered, once they were alone in the garden, safely beyond the reach of servants' ears. Pembroke said the letters served their purpose. That the marriage was needed. Clara, he's after the estate. Clara's expression sharpened with the focus of a woman who had spent years untangling other people's secrets. Then we find proof. A man like Pembroke doesn't orchestrate something this elaborate without leaving a trail. Letters need paper. Paper needs a source. They began quietly, too quietly for Pembroke to notice. Clara, ever resourceful, befriended one of the household maids who mentioned, almost in passing, that Lord Pembroke had dismissed a footman rather suddenly some weeks before the scandal broke, a footman who had once served in the correspondence room, handling the family's private letters. Find him, Eleanor said. Please, Clara. If anyone knows the truth, it's him. It took 4 days. Clara returned pale and breathless, clutching a folded paper. He's in York, working at a coaching inn. He wouldn't say much, he's terrified of Pembroke, Eleanor, genuinely terrified, but he gave me this before I left. Eleanor unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a draft, an unfinished letter in a hand she didn't recognize, practicing phrases that would later appear, nearly verbatim, in the letters blamed on Margaret. Beside it, a note in the same hand, Lord P. wants tone matched to Miss M. Whitmore's correspondence exactly. Must be convincing. Her sister's handwriting had been forged. Eleanor sat down hard on the garden bench, the paper shaking in her grip. Margaret hadn't betrayed anyone. Margaret hadn't been careless or cruel. She had been used, a convenient name attached to letters she never wrote, to destroy an engagement and force the Duke into exactly the kind of desperate, reputation-saving marriage that would leave his estate vulnerable to a scheming cousin waiting patiently in the wings. That was the moment everything changed. Eleanor found the Duke in his study within the hour, the forged draft clutched in her hand, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your Grace. I need you to look at this." He read it once. Then again, slower, his face draining of color as understanding settled over him like ice water. "This is not your sister's hand." "No," Eleanor said. "It was made to look like hers. Margaret never wrote those letters, Ashford. Your cousin did, or had done, to ruin your engagement and force you into a marriage he believed would weaken your position enough to seize your estate." The Duke's hands closed into fists atop his desk. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the paper as though it might rearrange itself into something less devastating. "I accused an innocent woman," he said finally, quietly. "I forced her sister into marriage over a lie my own cousin constructed." He looked up at Eleanor, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through his composure. "I owe you an apology far greater than the one you rode here to give." "You owe Margaret one," Eleanor said. "But right now, we need to decide what we intend to do about Lord Pembroke, before he realizes we know." They agreed to say nothing, not yet. If Pembroke suspected they had uncovered the truth, he would destroy what little evidence remained and disappear before consequences could reach him. Instead, the Duke moved carefully, quietly reviewing the estate's ledgers, the correspondence with creditors, the small, accumulating signs of a man positioning himself to inherit what was never meant to be his. What he found chilled him more than the forged letters had. "Pembroke has been meeting with my creditors," the Duke told Eleanor that night, spreading papers across his desk with hands that were not quite steady. "Quietly encouraging them to call in debts early, painting our marriage as evidence I am drowning, that Ashford is a poor risk. If enough creditors withdraw their patience at once, I could lose the estate within the month, and Pembroke, as my nearest male relation, stands to inherit whatever remains." "He built the scandal to trap you into marrying a merchant's daughter," Eleanor said slowly, "so that the marriage itself would look like desperation. He's been planning your ruin for months. Perhaps longer." The Duke's voice was low, hollowed by a betrayal he was only beginning to comprehend. "He is my father's sister's son. I trusted him." Eleanor watched him, this proud, guarded man, stripped now of the composure that had governed every interaction between them since her arrival, and felt something shift inside her chest that she did not have a name for yet. Not pity. Something closer to understanding. "We need the footman to testify," she said. "Openly. Before witnesses who matter. A forged draft is evidence, but a living man who can describe Pembroke's instructions directly, that is proof no one can dismiss." "He's frightened," Clara said. "Men like Pembroke do not forgive loose ends quietly." "Then we protect him. Bring him here, under the estate's protection, before Pembroke realizes he's been found." Eleanor met the Duke's eyes. "I know what it is to be the one everyone assumes is guilty, Ashford. I won't let it happen to a man who's already frightened half to death." The Duke studied her for a long moment, this woman he had married out of desperate calculation, who had every reason to hate him for the accusation he'd hurled at her family, and who was instead fighting to protect a stranger from the very scheme that had nearly ruined them both. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. "After everything I accused you of. Everything I forced upon you." Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "Because the truth matters more than my pride. And because," she added, softer, "you did not know the truth when you made your accusation. You were deceived as thoroughly as I was." Something passed between them then, fragile, unspoken, dangerous in its warmth. "Bring the footman," the Duke said finally. Quietly. "Tonight, if Clara can manage it." But by the time Clara's carriage reached York, the footman had vanished, and a note left in his abandoned room bore Pembroke's unmistakable, threatening hand. "Gone," Clara said, breathless from the ride back, her face pale with fury and fear. His room was cleared out. The innkeeper said a well-dressed gentleman came asking questions 2 days ago. "Eleanor, he knows." The Duke's study, which had felt like a place of careful strategy only hours before, now felt like the eye of a collapsing storm. "Then he knows we found the draft. He knows we suspect him." He pressed his palms flat against the desk, jaw tight. "Without the footman's testimony, we have nothing but a scrap of paper and speculation. Pembroke will simply claim the draft is a forgery of our own making, a desperate attempt by a disgraced merchant family to escape the consequences of the scandal." "He'll move faster now," Eleanor said. "If he believes we're closing in." She was interrupted by the study door opening without a knock. Lord Pembroke stood in the frame, smiling with the same easy warmth he always wore, though his eyes had gone flat and cold. "Ashford." "Duchess. I understand you've been making inquiries in York." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. "I do wish you'd come to me directly rather than chasing frightened servants across the countryside. It's terribly undignified." "You forged the letters," the Duke said, his voice deadly calm. "You destroyed an innocent woman's reputation and manipulated me into a marriage you believed would ruin me. I secured your future, cousin. A duke without an heir, without a wife, drowning quietly in debt no one else could see, that was the man I was trying to save." Pembroke's smile didn't waver. "You're welcome, by the way. She's rather lovely, for a merchant's daughter. You called in creditors early. You engineered my ruin so you could inherit what remained of it. I engineered stability, Ashford. If you'd simply signed the papers I brought you last spring, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary." Pembroke's gaze slid to Eleanor, and something in it made her skin crawl. "But I confess, I hadn't accounted for a Whitmore woman with a talent for meddling." "The footman is gone," Eleanor said. "But he's a person, Lord Pembroke, not a piece of paper you can simply misplace. If any harm has come to him—" "Harm is such an ugly word, Duchess." Pembroke's smile finally faded into something harder. "I'd advise you both to consider carefully what you intend to do with your suspicions. Accusations against a man of my standing require proof. And proof, I'm afraid, has a way of disappearing." He left as calmly as he'd entered, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt like a verdict. For a long moment, no one in the study spoke. The fire in the grate had burned low, and the Yorkshire wind rattled hard against the windows, as though the whole house held its breath. "We have nothing," the Duke said finally, sinking into his chair, all the careful composure of a duke stripped away to reveal simply a man staring at the ruin of everything he'd built. "No witness. No proof he'll admit to. And a cousin who has just told us, quite plainly, that he intends to destroy whoever stands in his way." Eleanor looked at the forged draft still lying on the desk between them, and at the man across from her who had gambled everything on a marriage born of scandal, and she refused, utterly, to believe it was truly over. The footman was found 2 days later, frightened but alive, hidden by Clara in a York safe house until he could be brought before the local magistrate under Ashford's protection. His testimony, paired with the forged draft, was enough. Pembroke fled before the constables arrived, his schemes unraveling as swiftly as he'd built them, and Ashford's creditors, once shown the truth, restored their faith in the estate entirely. Margaret's name was cleared publicly, her tears finally ones of relief. That evening, in the quiet warmth of the study where it had all unraveled, the Duke took Eleanor's hand, not from obligation now, but choice. "I married a stranger to save my name," he said softly. "I never imagined I'd fall in love with my wife." Eleanor smiled, truly, for the first time since that fateful letter. "Neither did I. What would you have done in her place?